President Trump received an experimental antibody therapy in addition to remdesivir and a steroid to treat his COVID-19 infection. What do we know about these drugs?
So although we don't have the play-by-play in terms of what President Trump went through and what his symptoms were like from the time he announced his positivity, that he did test positive for COVID-19 and then eventually was taken to the hospital, we do know that he did receive these three medications. Remdesivir, the first one, has been circulating in the news basically since the spring, summer of this year already. It's an IV administered antiviral drug that was originally designed as a general antiviral. It was then later used in the Ebola outbreak. And the way this medication works is that it binds to a protein in the virus that is responsible for replicating the virus, and so it prevents the propagation of viral replication. And at this time, we do know that this medication has been given emergency use authorization by the FDA, and it is used in hospitalized patients, regardless of the severity. And just recently, actually, the New England Journal of Medicine did release an article that showed that this medication does help shorten the time to recovery and also may show some clinical improvement in patients receiving this medication. So that's definitely hopeful. The second medication was dexamethasone, and this is a type of corticosteroid that we've used for decades in different types of inflammatory conditions, anywhere from like severe asthma, COPD, to an allergic reaction even, and most recently in the fight against COVID. And so the way dexamethasone and corticosteroids work is by basically, through its anti-inflammatory effects, it dampens the excess immune response that we are seeing in COVID-19, which ends up causing more damage to our organs. And so it dampens that. And this has been studied, and in the recovery trial, in the group of patients that were moderately to severely ill, and were on oxygen supplementation or on a ventilator, mechanical ventilator, to help with breathing, we see that this medication actually helps reduce mortality rates. So that also is a very positive finding with this medication. And then the third drug that President Trump received is this new experimental antibody therapy made by the company Regeneron. And it actually consists of two different monoclonal antibodies. And the way these antibodies work are they bind to the proteins on the SARS-CoV-2 virus to prevent it from entering and infecting the cells of our body. So theoretically, this should work relatively well, but unfortunately, we don't have much evidence behind this. It is a drug that is still being studied, so it's in clinical trials. We don't know the results yet. It has not been approved for emergency use by the FDA, but it was given to President Trump on compassionate use. So I'm sure that we'll be hearing a lot more about this medication as the trials are completed, and potentially if this medication does eventually get emergency use authorization. And then there were some reports also that outside of these three medications, President Trump has been receiving things like vitamin D, zinc, melatonin, and famotidine, which is an acid blocker. And there is some evidence behind vitamin D helping with COVID-19, especially in patients that have vitamin D deficiency to begin with. And then there was a paper that came out late in September that it was a bit of a low quality study and a small study, but it did show some reduction in mortality rates in patients that were receiving famotidine or the acid blocker. There, however, is no evidence behind the use of zinc or melatonin in COVID-19 patients. So we're not yet at a stage where we can say these medications are cures or they're fantastic, everyone should be taking these. We just don't have that information yet. But as we've discussed, there are many studies going on, and we should be hopefully hearing more about these medications and what types of patients should be receiving these medications for the benefits.
The president tweeted, "Don't be afraid of COVID." What was your reaction as a medical professional when you heard that?
Well, I was pleased to hear that President Trump was doing better, and I wish him, as well as the staff of the White House that have been diagnosed with COVID-19, a speedy recovery. But quite honestly, I was hoping for more of a message that would help the American public realize that this is a serious illness and that we need to be taking science into account. We need to unite as a country to fight against this pandemic. While no one is saying that we need to continue to live in fear, we have to remember that President Trump's tweet reflects his own personal experience with COVID-19, and we know that the spectrum of symptoms is very broad, and that he has access to the best medical care, as he should. He is the president of our nation, but we as the public do not have access to medications that he does, and we can't ignore the numbers. We know that COVID-19 has up until today, 210,000 people have lost their lives to COVID-19, and thousands more are living with this, with the complications of this disease, even though they were infected months ago. So to state that we shouldn't be afraid, I think really undermines the fact that this pandemic is serious, and that we must work together to continue to take all the precautions. We are still leading the world as the #1 country with the highest number of COVID-19 patients, as well as the highest death rate. So the numbers speak for themselves, and I will continue to encourage my patients as well as the viewers to protect yourself and take all the precautions to prevent transmission.
The president also compared the coronavirus to the flu again, saying it's far less deadly than the flu. To clarify, how much deadlier is COVID-19?
Sure, yes. Unfortunately, this is a misleading statement. When we look at both viruses, we know that there are some similarities. They're both respiratory illnesses. They are contagious, and they have a spectrum of overlapping symptoms that can range from very mild illness to a very severe illness and potentially even cause death. However, there are quite a few differences as well to recognize. The flu virus largely spreads only when someone is symptomatic, whereas unfortunately, as we've seen during this pandemic, the asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 has played a huge role in this pandemic. So someone may not be exhibiting any symptoms and can potentially infect others. And we are continuing to learn more about this disease, but we do know that when it comes to causing death, COVID-19 exceeds the rates at which the flu virus is seen. So the CDC does collect data yearly on influenza, how many people are infected, how many people are hospitalized, how many people end up passing away from the flu. And when you just look at the data in the last 10 years, there has never been a year where the death rate has exceeded 100,000 deaths. That was a false claim. When we look at the data, on average, the death rate is typically around 36,000 deaths per year. When we average out the 10 years. The 2017-2018 season was the deadliest, I would say, and the maximum death estimate was around 61,000 deaths that year. And when we compare that number, the 61,000, to over 210,000 deaths that we've had from COVID, I mean, we can see that the flu virus causes a fraction of the deaths that COVID-19 has caused just within our country. You know, at this point, we can't give you an exact number because the pandemic is still upon us. We are still seeing patients being infected. We're still seeing patients dying from it. But the WHO has estimated the mortality ratio to be anywhere from 0.25 to as high as 3%. And when you compare that to the flu mortality rate, which is typically under 0.1%, we can see there's a stark difference, and that you can say COVID-19 is deadlier at this point. Additionally, I'd also like to remind people that it's important to remember that we have been exposed to the flu for many, many years. We have a flu vaccine that's very effective. We have antiviral treatments for the flu. And so that also reduces the burden of disease every year. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is new. Our bodies have never been exposed to this. And as of now, there are no vaccines that are FDA approved, nor are there treatments. They're being studied and they're under development, but we don't have the tools that we need to fight off this infection. So as we approach flu season, I'm going to put my plug in to get your flu shot. The co-infection of COVID-19 and flu is possible, and people can get both. And so I want to remind our viewers to get their flu shots as soon as possible, especially this month, because we don't want a second pandemic overlapping the current one that we're already dealing with.
The CDC recently reversed its guidance and acknowledged the risk of airborne transmission. Do we know how much of a role that airborne transmission plays in spreading the virus?
This actually has been debated for quite some time this year. We know, and we've known about the respiratory droplets and the contact transmission as the primary modes of transmission of COVID-19. And in July, the WHO did release a statement saying that infection through aerosolized particles has been seen in medical procedures, so in a hospital setting where these particles are aerosolized and potentially can infect others within the same room. And they had stated something along the lines of this may happen in poorly ventilated non-medical settings also. This past week, we did see that the CDC has now acknowledged that this is a mode of transmission, and that comes after studying several instances where they were trying to figure out exactly how the infection spread, and specifically the Washington choir scenario. There was a restaurant in China in which there were a couple infected individuals, and people that were further away were also infected, and then there were a couple buses that were going to a Buddhist temple where the infection rates also spiked. And so studying these scenarios, they have concluded that aerosolized transmission is possible. And so we do have to think about that as we go into the winter season. What does that mean, basically? So when we're speaking, when we're singing or deep breathing or sneezing or coughing, we release a cloud of particles, some of which are very heavy and larger. And these are the droplets that we have known that potentially could carry this virus. And they usually land between 3 to 6 feet of us. What we're seeing now is that the smaller particles, they do eventually settle, but it takes them a longer time because they are lighter, they're smaller. They can travel further than 6 feet. They can linger in the air around us for minutes to hours after they are emitted. And so these potential particles can pose a risk, especially in poorly ventilated, enclosed areas in which there are crowds of people participating in activities that involve heavier breathing, like singing or exercise. And so as winter season is upon us, more people are going to be spending time indoors. We do have to keep this in mind. Not only should we be considering the distance between one person to another, but we do have to think about the airflow, the ventilation, and the air filtration, along with some of the precautions that we're already taking, like masking and disinfecting and washing your hands frequently.